part about this club is the fact we have so many talented and skilled people, and today's speaker is certainly one of them. She was born and raised in Bergen County, New Jersey. I'm from New Jersey also. Guess what? Attended Smith College, the University of Pennsylvania, and Emory University School of Law. And I didn't even know she was a lawyer. She moved to Orlando in 1989, and that's, of course, where her husband, Daniel, grew up. And our charming Lori Peterson Weiss has 3 children and 3 cats. 4 cats. We stand corrected. And we at the University Club, of course, know her for her not legal experience, but her popular play reading group. So I'm not going to waste time. Come along, Lori, and let's hear from you.
How could you not love Sherry Levy? It's not even possible. First of all, I just want to thank everybody who made this so nice. Molly, you did a beautiful job. Ed, you got to put together a great menu. And Pat, is Pat here? I appreciate her putting me at the head table, so I got to eat first. Anyway, you all know that Passover starts tomorrow, and my subject of Jewish immigration, it just cannot have been planned more fortuitously, because the Passover story is the story of the Jews' freedom, leaving Egypt, immigrating to the Promised Land, and that's pretty much what I'm talking about today. So, welcome and Shabbat Shalom. Let me just for one moment digress. When I say Shabbat Shalom, just one funny thing. During the first season of Curb Your Enthusiasm, Larry David is wrongly accused of stealing silverware. And so he has to go to court, and he goes to court on a Friday, and he's appearing before the judge, and he notices that the judge has a Jewish name. So he says, "Good morning, Your Honor, and may I say Shabbat Shalom?" Okay, with immigration being such a hot topic in our country and around the world, I'm reminded of the wave of my Jewish ancestors who more than a century ago also sought refuge in America. It is a fascinating part of American Jewish history, which has been portrayed in countless books and movies. To my mind, though, the most reliable way of seeking historical truth is to look at primary sources, accounts written by persons with firsthand experience. Today, I want to talk about how the Jewish immigration experience was actually experienced by real people who, thanks to a man named Abraham Cahan, C-A-H-A-N, were provided a platform for sharing their challenges, their pain, their joys, and their lives through a popular and now legendary column, the Bintel Brief, in the first and largest Yiddish newspaper in America, the Jewish Daily Forward, or as it was called in Yiddish, the Vorwärts. Randy Ellington texted me. He wasn't able to be here because he's in Mexico, but he told me that his grandmother was an avid reader of the Bintel Brief, and Susan Rogers, another member, also remembered the column fondly. By the way, Bintel Brief translates to bundle of letters in English. The letters reflected every issue, including those most personal confronting new immigrants. While fascinating in their own right, it is especially interesting to note how the weightiness of the problems change over the decades as new generations emerge with new problems, creating all sorts of different problems for their immigrant parents, in addition to succeeding generations having problems of their own. In order to learn how the Jewish Daily Forward and its popular advice column, Bintel Brief, came to mirror and document the experiences of Jewish immigrants to America, it is helpful to review the history of Jewish immigration in general as a way of understanding the underlying pathos reflected in the column's earliest letter writers. The Jewish immigration experience began back in 1492 when Ferdinand and Isabella ordered the expulsion of thousands of Jews from Spain who refused to convert to Christianity. The Sephardim, which refers to Jews of Spanish or Portuguese descent, fled to other parts of Europe, such as France, Italy, Greece, Turkey. The first Jewish immigrant to set foot in the New World was Luis de Torres, a converso who served as a linguist and interpreter for Columbus, owing to his knowledge of Hebrew and Arabic. For those who don't know, a converso refers to a Jew who converted upon the order of Ferdinand and Isabella to Roman Catholicism, so they wouldn't have to be killed. The people who didn't want to convert fled. Okay. Not only was de Torres the first Jewish immigrant to the Americas, but he was also the first person to step foot in the New World. In fact, there was a synagogue for like 30 or 40 years, maybe 50 years, in the Bahamas, named after Luis de Torres in recognition of his involvement in the discovery of the New World. This discovery took place in Santo Domingo, which came to be known today as Hispaniola, which is an island divided between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And Hispaniola became a haven for Sephardic Jews. The second period of Jewish immigration to America started with the Napoleonic Wars, followed by the 1848 revolutions some decades later. The third major wave, labeled the Grand Migration, began in 1880 and continued through the first 2 decades of the 20th century. More than 2.5 million Jews emigrated to the United States from Eastern Europe, and about 350,000 settled in Western Europe, largely in the United Kingdom and France. Another 300,000 emigrated to Palestine, Canada, and Mexico. Charles's family emigrated to Ecuador. All were escaping the pogroms and both economic and social persecution in Tsarist Russia, as well as persecution in neighboring countries. About 5 million Jews, which is about 40% of the Jewish population worldwide, were forced to relocate to the Pale of Settlement in Western Russia with no rights as citizens. Beyond these places, Jewish residency, permanent or temporary, was mostly forbidden. Eastern European Jews were regaled with tales and rumors of what America held for them and what it represented: the Golden Land, freedom, equality. In short, it was a beacon of light and hope and refuge for the suffering and persecuted who wanted to find peace and be treated like human beings. It was their dreams of the American dream that gave them courage to leave their countries on foot, cut across the borders of other countries under dark of night, traveling by horse, then wagon, then train, only to then have to endure a long and painful, expensive voyage across the ocean. Nearly 70% of these families had paid their passage with money borrowed from relatives, money that had to be repaid. And you see in letters, that was a constant stress to these new immigrants. More than any horses, wagons, trains, or ships, though, it was hope that got them to Ellis Island, confident that their lives would change magically once they arrived in America. That wasn't exactly the case. Although many immigrants, when they did arrive, on the shores of, New York, many immigrants were encouraged to go west, and a lot of them did go to the Midwest and West, but the majority of them settled in the Lower East Side, which Lower East Side tenements to be near their family and friends. Upon emigrating to the United States, immigrants were detained at Castle Gardens. In 1890, the Immigration Processing Station was moved to Ellis Island, where they endured strict physical examinations and given long questionnaires to complete. According to Isaac Metzger, who had been a staff writer at the Forward for 40 years and who had compiled and edited both volumes of a Bintel Brief, many were detained for minor reasons. And these are the books that I was able to use. They're the only books that compile the letters of the Bintel Brief. And there's 2 volumes, one that goes up to like the 50s or 60s and one that goes up to the 80s. And wait, I'm just reminded, Ed, I wanted if you could just put these on the table while I'm talking. The Jewish Forward, and I'm going to talk about it in a moment, but it's still in existence today online. And I printed out the cover page that's online, and also showed the different sections of the newspaper that they have now, including the Bintel Brief, which is still in existence. Okay. For the immigrants who did manage to pass the examinations, new problems would occasionally arise. Not every immigrant had money or relatives or friends awaiting him, and those without a potential source of income were detained again. The examinations became stricter as the years went by, and immigrants were being sent back, hundreds at a time. For those who succeeded, instead of streets paved with gold, Jewish immigrants were faced with giant struggles of different kinds that they had faced at home. There was massive culture shock in moving from their old way of life in shtetls to new life in a huge crowded city where large families were crammed into small spaces, often with relatives who had taken them in. I don't know if any of you have been to the Tenement Museum. Yeah, it is really worth going to, and it's not just where the Jewish immigrants were. It was the Asian immigrants and all different ethnicities. They all lived in the tenements, and they have these rooms that are like, not this, 10 by 10, and they would have different generations all living in the same room, and then there was sharing a bathroom. It's really worth going to see. And then when you're done, you go to Katz's Deli, sort of across the street, and that's another interesting thing. When the immigrants came here, there was keeping kosher was what they did, but it became harder and harder to do, which I'll explain in a moment. But Katz's Deli opened in 1910, and it was not a kosher restaurant, but it was a culturally Jewish and culinarily Jewish restaurant. And this catered, to the people who are, moving a little bit towards America. And, it's still a good restaurant. All right. So they had massive culture shock. It became difficult, if not impossible, to recreate and maintain their traditional Jewish lives in the new world, as frequently, in order to get a job, for example, they would have to be able to work on Shabbat, the Sabbath, and shave their beards. Between hardship and assimilation, it also became increasingly difficult to maintain the laws of kashrut, which is keeping kosher in the home, which dictate how to keep a kosher home. Because they did not have their farms where they could raise livestock and grow their own food, they found themselves without bread, milk, and rent money, with the added stress, as I said before, of not being able to repay relatives who brought them over. Poverty was oppressive, and most immigrants lived in squalor. Although I don't read letters that are exclusively about poverty, that poverty underlined every single problem, created every problem that is featured in these letters. There were many suicides. Working conditions were unregulated and unsafe. The most famous consequence of the latter was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in Greenwich Village on March 25th, 1911, which is 114 years ago. It's still commemorated at its location on Green Street to this day. It was the deadliest industrial disaster in the city's history, and 146 people were killed as a result of fire, smoke inhalation, and jumping from windows. Women, men, and child garment workers on the 9th floor of the building had been unable to escape when the massive fire erupted. Doors to stairwells and exits were locked, which was a common practice of employers to prevent workers from taking unauthorized breaks and reduce theft. There's lots of letters about this. I can't, read them all, but if you look at the books, you'll see. I'll read just part of one. This is from 1911. Dear editor, I am a newsboy, 14 years old, and I sell the Vorwärts in the street till late into the night. I come to you to ask your advice. I was born in Russia and was 12 years old when I came to America with my dear mother. My sister, who was in the country before us, brought us over. My sister worked and supported us. She didn't allow me to go to work, but sent me to school. I went to school for 2 years and didn't miss a day. But then came the terrible fire at the Triangle shop where she worked, and I lost my dear sister. My mother and I suffered terribly from this misfortune. I had to help my mother, and after school hours, I go out and sell newspapers. I have to go to school 3 more years, and after that I want to go to college. But my mother doesn't want me to go to school because she thinks I should go to work. I tell her I will work days and study at night, but she won't hear of it. Since I read the 4 verts to my mother every night and read your answers in the Bintel brief, I beg you to answer me and say a few words. The answer was, you need to stay in school. The unfortunate woman is told she must not hinder her son's nighttime studies, but must help him reach his goal. And an appeal is made to good people who are in a position to do something for the boy to come forward and help him further his education. This was always communicating to the community, these letters, and when needed, they would direct them to HIAS, which is the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, or all different organizations, organizations to help, women find their husbands who deserted them. I mean, the Forward was a very valuable resource for new immigrants, and really that's how it came to be. The editor writes, "The Triangle fire was a disaster." And he said this, "My mother, along with other East Side mothers, hung a piece of black crepe out of the window on the day of the funeral. All the girls were buried in the Workmen's Circle Cemetery, and the cortege was followed by some 100,000 workers." Okay. And one other one, I won't read this letter, but there's a woman and her intended came over from Russia to New York, and they were to be married, and they call her bridegroom, and he was the most wonderful person. She loved him dearly. They were so devoted to each other, and they both worked in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. And when the fire came about, she felt somebody grab her from behind and rescue her and bring her to safety, and it was her husband. And then he said, "Listen, you stay here. I have to go save the other women." And in going to save the other women, he was killed. And the stories are so terrible, but and she said, "I can't love anybody else. Somebody wants to marry me, but I just can't. I can't let go." And the answer is, you need to let go. All right. It took a tragedy of this magnitude to inspire laws protecting workers and spurred the growth of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, which fought for better working conditions for sweatshop workers. That was my favorite commercial growing up, the Ladies Garment Worker jingle, which I know a lot of you remember. I have played it for my children. It's so wonderful. Look for the union label. Yes, we can all sing it later. We can. All right. Other unions to protect immigrant workers followed. Okay. Who's it? Let's say she had been 18 at the time. Now, who am I talking about with she? I don't know. Whatever. She, and had survived by going up to the roof, as did the 2 ignominious Jewish immigrant owners of the factories, and that was not unusual. So many of the factories were owned by Jews who emigrated. You can ask me later what happened to these 2 owners, and I hope you will. This was the climate in America that propelled Abraham Khan, who himself had emigrated to the United States from Lithuania in 1882. He was fleeing the mass roundup of revolutionaries after the assassination of Alexander II in 1881. It propelled him to create the Bintel Brief in 1907, after having been among a group of about 50 Yiddish-speaking socialists who founded the Jewish Daily Forward in 1897. By 1912, its circulation was 120,000, and by the late 20s and early 30s, it was a leading U.S. metropolitan daily with considerable influence and a nationwide circulation of over 275,000. This dropped to 170,000 by 1939 as a result of immigration policy changes that drastically restricted Jewish immigration. To underscore the political impact of this column in its early years, in 1909, the paper received a letter signed by 100 Jewish men and boys who were being held on Ellis Island, describing the dreadful conditions under which they were being held indefinitely. Protests and articles generated by this letter forced Washington to begin an investigation into treatment of these immigrants, resulting in the firing of the immigration commissioner. I was going to read this letter, but it's kind of long, so I'm not going to read it, but they really describe in detail how horrible. I mean, it's you can't even imagine. I mean, it sounded almost like what the Nazis did to the Jews without gas chambers. They were in squalid conditions. There was no sanitation. For a little room that was supposed to fit 200 people, there were 1,000 people. And the letter went on, and it was signed by 100 of the immigrants that had been just, in holding pattern in Ellis Island, I guess sort of like Guantanamo, I don't know. But there were no women who signed it because the men were not allowed to contact the women. The Jewish Daily Forward was written entirely in Yiddish. English language supplements were added in 1983. These supplements were converted to a full-fledged weekly edition. I actually had subscribed to it. It was a great paper. In 2016, publication of the Yiddish version changed its print format from a bi-weekly newspaper to a monthly magazine. The English version followed suit in 2017. Both magazines were published until 2019, and today both editions are published free online, and that is what you can pass around at your tables, what I've handed you to look at. It's really interesting. They have they're very intellectual, cultural. It's really a great newspaper, and for people who want different perspectives on, Israel and just whatever. And the Bintel Brief is still in it. Okay. As of December 2023, the Forward's journalism is now free and available to everyone, eliminating the need for a paid digital description. But they are open to donations, and I just made a donation because they have a matching fund. But it is, it's been such an important part of our Jewish history that I felt good about making a donation. All right, now we can begin discussing the intended focus of my talk, Bintel Brief, one of the oldest advice columns in the United States, and certainly the oldest one still in existence. Abraham Kahan was editor-in-chief of the Jewish Daily Forward for nearly 50 years, from 1902 until a stroke in 1946 led to his death in 1951. I could give a long, detailed talk about the fascinating history of the Forward, but that's not my direct mission today. In short, though, it started as a means of helping the burgeoning immigrant population assimilate into a scary new culture, and it kept them abreast in their native Yiddish of local and national news, as well as news from Eastern Europe. Abraham Kahan also enlivened the Forward with light articles and stories dealing with daily life, with writers such as Isaac Bashevis Singer being among its most frequent contributor. It was also a highly literary newspaper. By presenting and sharing stories, it enabled immigrants to recreate a semblance of the communities they left behind. Many wrote about the old world, and it was just. It was so tremendously helpful emotionally to the immigrants. I could give an even longer talk about Abraham Kahan, who was a brilliant, passionate, complicated man who led a remarkable life. But again, that's not what I'm here to focus on today. But briefly, Kahan was, among myriad other things, a moderate socialist, a tireless political and human rights activist, a short story writer, and a successful novelist, and a decades-long journalist. His two most famous novels were Yekel, A Tale of the New York Ghetto, upon which the film Hester Street was made, and The Rise of David Levinsky, which was a terrific book, which I was introduced to in a Jewish literature class I took in college. Jim, what college was that, Jim? Uh-huh. Yeah, that was it. Okay. And that was my first introduction to Abraham Kahan. Both are wonderful stories. I don't know that anybody's heard of these, but if you can read The Rise of David Levinsky, it's really worth reading. Okay, Abraham Kahan conceived the Bintel Brief as a means of helping Jewish immigrants adapt to their new country, which included the importance of learning English and becoming acquainted with American customs. In his autobiography, Kahan wrote that the genesis of the advice column came from a letter the paper received from a woman from Eldridge Street who wanted to use the Vorwärts in order to appeal to her neighbor to return a watch. Once, when she had to go out, the neighbor agreed to keep an eye on her house. When she returned home, she noticed that the watch was missing. It soon became apparent to her that it was in a pawn shop. She didn't think her neighbor was a thief, but she suspected the neighbor of pawning the watch since her husband was out of work and the family was in extreme need. In her letter, the woman wrote that she understood the neighbor's situation and felt her pain, but she feared that her husband would also lose his job too and would have to frequent the pawn shop. So, if her neighbor could give her the pawn ticket, then she'd be perfectly willing to pretend that nothing happened. Her neighbor could leave the ticket anywhere around the house. She'd soon find it. She ended the letter by inviting the neighbor to come over again, assuring her that she was always a welcome guest. Kahan wrote that's how comfortable these people felt writing, to Bintel Brief, and they knew that everybody read it. Kahan wrote that, even Randy Ellington's grandmother, Kahan wrote that this type of letter would never have been sent to a newspaper had the forward not shown the public that such everyday events, human interest stories, were something we knew to be important for a newspaper. Bintel Brief was born soon after, with this being the first letter to be printed. Kahan wrote that the essence of Bintel Brief surely is to be found in the quiet tragedies of our lives. True, incredible pages from the Book of Life. I'll read to you some of the letters from Bintel Brief, probably the most accurate documentation of how Jewish lives, priorities, and values changed over the decades the further removed from Ellis Island the families became. From 1906 through much of the 20s, letters describe the heartaches and conundrums confronting the Jews, greenhorns in this new land. Although they had been eager to leave the old country for what they perceived as the land of golden opportunity, it was difficult to take the old country out of the Jews. Back home, their whole lives centered on Judaism and traditions going back for generations. The letters were a blueprint of concerns, problems, hopes, and gratitude. As assimilation took its course, so did the tenor of the letters. The Bintel Brief came to resemble more of a Dear Abby kind of personal advice column on how to deal with less weighty, more modern problems that you didn't necessarily have to be Jewish to experience. And let me just say that the early letters, the Jewish immigrant experience, the Italians could have written the same kind of letters. Everybody had the same, all the people who came to Ellis Island, had the same experience. The Jews were lucky that they had this Bintel Brief and Jewish Forward to help them so significantly in becoming part of, their new world. All right, there were many letters, for example, written by seniors in their 60s, 70s, this is the later ones, seniors in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, trying to make sense of their lives and marriages now that the children had lives of their own with their own children. As much as they yearned to live in America when they were young, it seems that finding success in America was no guarantee of contentment in later years when there were no existential threats to keep them occupied. Husbands and wives were now bickering over each other's faults or dealing with loneliness after a spouse's death, often leading to an unhappy second marriage. They had issues with their children and grandchildren, some relating sadness over the secular upbringing of their grandchildren and the seeming disappearance of Judaism in the next generation. There was one letter that made me laugh. the grandparents, were close to, their grandchildren, and, they would visit, I guess, weekly. And then their kids decided they were going to go take a trip wherever, a 2-week trip, and told the grandparents, they had to watch their kids for 2 weeks. And the grandfather said, he's exhausted after being with them for 1 or 2 days. I can't do it. His wife was willing to do it, and he just absolutely refused to do it. And he was angry at his children for just thinking that they were always going to be there for them. Now, this was in the early part of the century when they all lived in the same, 10 by 10 foot room. Anyway, but there were still lots of letters of gratitude for their many blessings, even if the husband was embarrassing her by flirting with young women or shouting at her for using too much makeup and taking too long to get ready when they have to go out. He did not understand, it seems, that she, now in her 50s, needed a little extra time to cover up the wrinkles. There were lots of letters about intermarriage, and really a lot of letters written by mothers-in-law complaining about daughters-in-laws, daughters-in-laws complaining about mothers-in-laws, and letters by both mothers-in-laws and daughter-in-laws writing about how grateful they were to be in each other's lives. I mean, it went all over the place, and was interesting to me, and I have said this to my children also, whenever there's any kind of angst going on in the family, whenever, the kids are mad about something, they always blame everything on the mother. Nobody, they will, I'm stupid, I'm this or that. Daddy is always perfect. Nobody says anything bad to daddy. The mother can take it, the father is too delicate, anyway. According to Leanna Fink, who wrote a graphic novel about Bintel Brief in 2013, the early letters are timeless and could have been written anywhere by anyone who had left his old life behind and traveled across the ocean to a new world. To read them is to get the essence of things. The later Bintel Brief letters, on the other hand, are bitter. As the Forward's leadership aged and dwindled, the letters were more often written by older people no longer new to America. They were the last bastions of the Yiddish language, watching sadly as their children grew up, went to college, made money, and became ashamed of their parents. Dear Mr. Editor, people would write, our children have a Christmas tree. Our children don't keep kosher. Our children don't want to read a Yiddish newspaper in public. It embarrasses them. And that was a particular letter where they were so embarrassed that their father brought the Forward to read on the subway. They were scared, and that was a 1939 letter. And this is when, things are starting to percolate, internationally, the anti-Semitism. But this was kind of a sad letter. Where is it? Wait, just a minute. It was here. Oh, yeah, here it is. It was written by a father who was, he was so sad because he felt that he had nothing in common with his kids anymore because they were educated and he wasn't. He said, suddenly I feel as if the floor has collapsed. And this was, I think, only 1938. And, you can imagine, suddenly I feel as if the floor has collapsed under my feet. I don't know how to express it, but the fact that my children are well educated and have outgrown me makes me feel bad. I can't talk to them about my problems, and they can't talk to me about theirs. It's as if there were a deep abyss that divides us. People envy me, my good, fine, educated children, but I am ashamed to admit it. I often think it might be better for me if they were not so well educated, but ordinary working men like me. Then we would have more in common. I have no education because my parents were poor, and in the old country they couldn't give me the opportunities that I could give my children. Here in America, I didn't have the time, and my mind wasn't on learning in the early years when I had to work hard. And this is my problem. I want to hear your opinion about it. They trusted the Bintel Brief like it was, the Bible. The answer was there's no reason why, you can't, you can't find common ground, with your children. You should be able to talk to your good children about various problems, even though they are professionals and have distanced him in education. And of course they're right. Anyway, let me see where I am. All right, now I want to read just a few letters and summaries from letters. The letters in the book, they are abbreviated, and I'm abbreviating them more for the sake of time. The answers were usually very long, but they were also shortened in the book. And I'm not necessarily reading the answers. I'm telling you the letters to show the concerns that the people had. One of the concerns was sending money. They were so worried about their relatives and family. They're back in the old country. And here's one letter from 1906. Esteemed editor, I hope that you will advise me in my present difficulty. I am a greenhorn, only 5 weeks in the country, and a jeweler by trade. I come from Russia, where I left a blind father and a stepmother. Before I left, my father asked me to not forget him. I promised that I would send him the first money I earned in America. When I arrived in New York, I walked around for 2 weeks looking for a job, and the bosses told me it was after the season. In the third week, I was lucky, found a job at which I earned $8 a week. I worked, I paid my landlady board, I bought a few things to wear, and I have a few dollars in my pocket. Now, I want you to advise me what to do. Shall I send my father a few dollars for Passover, or should I keep the little money for myself? In this place, the work will end soon, and I may be left without a job. The question is how to deal with the situation. I will do as you tell me. The answer to this young man is that he should send his father the few dollars for Passover, because since he is young, he will find it easier to earn a living than would his blind father in Russia. Yeah, I know. So many heartbreaking letters. There's also a lot of funny letters, really funny letters. This is one. Actually, this is a funny one. I mean, it's like comic relief in the midst of all this stuff. This is also 1906. This problem is a little less serious. I am a young man of 21. I have a 17-year-old cousin, and she and her parents would like me to marry her. I like the girl. She's educated, American-born, not bad-looking, but she's quite small. That is the drawback. For her age, she is very short, and I happen to be tall. So when we walk down the street together, people look at us like we're a poorly matched couple. One more thing, she's very religious, and I am a free thinker. I ask you, esteemed editor, could this lead to an unpleasant life if we were to marry? I wait impatiently for your answer. Love conquers all. Many such couples live happily, and it is better for the man to be taller than the woman, shorter, not the opposite. People are accustomed to see, they're so sexist in the responses, over the decades. It's really interesting. People are accustomed to seeing the man more developed than the woman. People stare, let them stare. Also, the fact that the girl is religious and the man is not can be overcome if he has enough influence on her. You see that a lot in these letters. Okay, there's a lot of letters, too, about the vulnerability of these young women in the workplace. This is from 1907. She moved, from the old country, went to work at a factory in Vineland, New Jersey, and the foreman there exploited the women. They always insulted them. The wages were really, really, really low, and he would try to take advantage of them sexually. And worst of all, this in spite of the fact that he has a wife and several children. He often allows himself to have fun with some of the working girls. It was my bad luck to be one of the girls that he tried to make advances to, and woe to any girl who doesn't willingly accept them. Well, though my few hard-earned dollars means a lot to my family of 8 souls, I didn't want to accept the foreman's vulgar advances. He started to pick on me, said my work was no good, and shouted at me in the vilest language. He insulted me in Yiddish, which tells you that this was a Jewish immigrant who was doing this to her, and then in English so the American workers could understand too. Then, as if the devil were after me, I ran home. I am left without a job. Can you imagine my circumstances and that of my parents who depend on my earnings? The girls in the shop were very upset over the foreman's vulgarity, but they don't want him to throw them out, so they're afraid to be witnesses against him. What can be done about this? I beg you to answer me. And another common letter, this was terrible, but the women who, when they were still in Russia, when the Cossacks came and murdered all their families, the women were sexually violated, rape, rape was the experience of really probably all the women that had been left behind during this time. And this woman, she says, I was born in a small town in Russia. My mother brought me up alone because my father died when I was young. A pogrom broke out, and my mother, this is 1923, by the way, and my mother was the first victim of the bloodbath. They spared no one, and no one was left for me. But that wasn't enough for the murderers. They robbed me of my honor. I begged them to kill me instead, but they let me live to suffer. And then she goes on, a few months ago, however, I met a young man, a refined and decent man. It didn't take long before we fell in love. He has already proposed marriage, and he is now waiting for my answer. I want to marry this man, but I keep putting off giving him an answer because I can't tell him the secret that weighs on my heart and bothers my conscience. This was not, an uncommon letter. The women, were ashamed of having been raped, and they were afraid that this would turn their intendeds against them. And the answer was, if these people really love you, they're going to understand you had no control over stuff. And that was probably usually the case. All right, so back a little comic relief. This is 1908. I ask you to give me some advice for my situation. I am a young man of 25, 16 years in America, and I recently met a fine girl. She has a flaw, however, that keeps me from marrying her. This is worse than being short. The fault is that she has a dimple in her chin. And it is said that people who have this lose their first husband or wife. At first, I laughed at the idea, but later it began to bother me. I began to observe people with dimpled chins and found that their first husbands or wives really had died prematurely. I got so interested in this that whenever I see someone with this defect, I ask about it immediately. And I find out that some of the men have lost their first wives, and some of the women's first husbands were dead. This upsets me so that I don't know what to do. I can't leave my sweetheart. I love her very much, but I'm afraid to marry her lest I die because of the dimple. Okay, perhaps you two will laugh at me for being such a fool and believing such nonsense, but I cannot rest until I hear your opinion about it. I want to add that my sweetheart knows nothing about this. And they said, essentially, you're being ridiculous. There's lots of people, with dimples whose spouses have lived to nice, old ages. This is another one I loved. It was a serious letter, but it was so funny to me. This was 1911. I am writing to you here about a serious, the Jews, because they still follow like the Jewish law rather than, the American law. Dear editor, I am writing to you here about a serious matter because I need your advice. My husband and I were married for 19 years, and we have two sons, 17 and 15 years old. We were divorced 3 months ago because we hadn't been getting along. But now we have reconsidered and realized we made a grave mistake and we want to correct it. We wanted to remarry, but we have difficulties. My husband is a Kohen, that's a member of the priestly tribe, and no rabbi will perform a religious ceremony for us. The rabbis we went to explained that it is against Jewish law for a Kohen to marry a divorced woman. That was hilarious. Okay. That's like catch 22 could have come out of that letter. Okay. A lot of letters involved intermarriages, and it's usually, the Jewish man marrying the sheksa, the non-Jewish woman. And these letters went both ways. Some parents at first were not happy with it, but then they grew to love this wonderful Christian daughter-in-law. Some of them, even converted and, of course, became more religious than their own kids because that is always the way with converts. And so this was interesting. 1928, I consider myself a progressive woman who thinks there should be no difference between Jews and Christians. Years ago, when I was a girl and sometimes heard that parents would not allow their children to marry a Christian, I maintained that they should not interfere. I believe that a fine Christian was as good as a fine Jew. Now, however, when my daughter has fallen in love with a Gentile, I have become one of those mothers who interferes because I am against this match. But she says, I'm not one of those fanatics about this, so we're going to sit Shiva, which was not uncommon. You know, sit Shiva, they pretend the child is as if they're dead. And I knew a family who almost went this far. Anyway, I don't know how to explain it. He is intelligent, quiet, and gentle, but somehow his nature and his way of thinking are different from that of a Jew. This is my favorite part. His parents are American Yankees, never miss a Sunday at church, and speak with reverence of President Coolidge. When I think that they might become my in-laws and their son, my daughter's husband, I tremble. I feel, a mother's heart feels that my daughter can never get used to these people. He says, you yourself answered everything in your letter, and, we feel the same way as you. Your daughter should also understand the match is not a good one, but, when one is in love, all arguments, are worthless. So, all right, a big tragedy in the early years that created a lot of widows was tuberculosis, which was called the workers' disease, and it was rampant. And when the husbands died, it left so many women penniless, and they all had a lot of children. They couldn't support themselves. They tried to go to relatives, and so many of them ended up putting one or two or three or all of their kids in orphanages until they can get them out. And that there's a whole bunch of letters about the orphanages. Anyway, it's the mothers write about their broken hearts. And there's one guy who wrote in, because he has TB, he has to stay away from his young daughter, who's so adorable, and he wants to kiss her all the time, and it is absolutely breaking his heart that he's not allowed to go near her. All right, children had to work to support the family. This is a short one. We work in a Bleecker Street shop where we make raincoats. With us is a 13-year-old boy who works hard for the $2.50 a week he earns. Just lately, it happened that the boy came to work 10 minutes late. This was a crime the bosses couldn't overlook, and for the lost 10 minutes, they docked him 2 cents. Isn't that a bitter joke? There were a lot of letters about detailing anti-Semitism at work. People went to work. They were kicked, they were shoved, they were fired, they were taunted, and they went from job to job, with these experiences. There were also there's also a letter, and a guy says, my son loves chemistry. He's a chemistry scholar, and he goes on and on about how devoted he is to chemistry and getting his advanced degree. And he says, but he can't, but I read, and I talk to chemists, and I talk to people, that Jews are not being hired. Jewish chemists, you're just not, you can't do it. So, and this is reminiscent also of how in the, the 40s and 50s, all the quotas on Jews in medical schools, law schools, dental schools, every decade there's a different problem with being Jewish. All right. And interesting, there was a father, with all this, anti-Semitism at work, a father was really upset when his daughter pretended to be Episcopalian to get a job. And he said she needs to quit, she can't do it. And the answer said, that's right, she absolutely cannot do it. The worst thing is denying your Judaism. Anyway, another letter, and I'm almost done, I know. The hunger for education, often at odds, and you saw that, with the children who are working, often at odds with the need to support families. This 14-year-old girl is writing. She had the parents. They have 5 kids, and they have no money. Very little money. My father hardly brings in anything, but my mother wants me to continue my education. In fact, she just spent $10 to buy me new winter clothes, and I don't enjoy wearing them because I'm feeling so horrible, and I want to stop school. And her mother says, "No, you have to go to school." And The advice that they gave, she should obey her parents and further her education, because in that way she will be able to give them greater satisfaction than if she went out to work. And the editor writes, the hunger for education was very great among the East Side Jews from Eastern Europe. Immigrant mothers who couldn't speak English went to the library and held up the fingers of their hand to indicate the number of children they had. They then would get a card, give it to each of the children, and say, go, learn, read. I graduated from PS 20 with George Gershwin, Edward G. Robinson, Paul Muni, and Senator Jacob Javits, all sons of immigrants. And then there's a funny one. I won't read it, but well, the husband, she's very upset because the woman wants to go to school at night, and he says, no, that's like a bridge too far. My husband is not pleased, and when I come home at night and ring the bell, he lets me stand outside a long time intentionally and doesn't hurry to open the door. Now he has announced a new decision. Because I send out the laundry to be done, it seems to him that I have too much time for myself, even enough to go to school. So from now on, he will count out every penny for anything I have to buy for the house, so I will not be able to send out the laundry anymore. And when I have to do the work myself, there won't be any time left for such foolishness as going to school. I told him that I'm willing to do my own washing, but that I would still be able to find time for study. And, the guy says, go to school, your husband's wrong. And he should be ashamed of himself. All right. Another common thing, because of the circumstances, remarriage when you thought the spouse was dead. People who came over, before their families, their wives or their husbands were waiting, they were waiting to hear from them, and they couldn't get in touch with them frequently. And they, after a long time, they just, they'd send them stuff and it'd be returned in the mail. And so they assumed they're dead. So this guy, he did everything. He went to America because he couldn't earn enough bread for his wife and 2 kids. They were in Poland. So he saved enough money finally to, get them a steamship ticket home. So the day I sent out the tickets was a holiday for me. I was happy I'd soon be with my family. I'd have a home like other people and not have to sit at strangers' table. But it turned out differently. My wife sent me a letter saying she didn't want to come. I couldn't understand why such a crazy idea should come to her. And then World War I broke out, and I didn't hear any more from my wife and children. When the war was over and sad news began to arrive from destroyed towns in Poland, I waited for word of my family. I traveled from Philadelphia to New York to make inquiries in various places, couldn't get any news about them. I was told they must be dead. I even sent money to my wife at the old address, but it came back. Anyway, in time, I began to go out with a girl. They got married and they had a kid. But recently, I was reading in the Foverts a list of the unfortunate displaced people who were looking for their relatives in America. And guess who showed up? He said it was as if I was paralyzed. I saw that my wife had arisen from the dead and was seeking me and asking for help. What do I do now? And he said that it's not your fault that all this happened because your wife didn't want to come back to you. You need to help her get a legal divorce. Desertion was a big deal. World War II. Now we're in the 40s, and the mother is writing in, she, and her husband, she came to America, as a young girl, 33 years ago. They raised 3 kids, 2 sons and a boy. And when Hitler began the war, her eldest son, the doctor, decided to volunteer for the army. Our children were always interested in world affairs and were concerned with the Jewish problems. I tried to talk him out of it and told my husband to discourage him, but my husband told me that our son knew what he was doing. Then we, that is America, declared war, and our second son also enlisted in the army. This time I didn't raise a fuss because I knew they would draft him anyway. Now, if that weren't enough that our sons went away, now our daughter wants to join the WACs. And she, said, do I have to give up my daughter? And they said, look, she's doing a good thing, and the husband agreed, and, everything will be okay. This is a really sad one, and I have to think that this is not uncommon either. This is 1945. Not long ago, through the forwards, everybody learns everything, through the forward. I learned that my brother's 8-year-old child was alive and living in France with a Gentile family. They are fine people, but I did not want my brother's child to remain with the Gentiles. I had hoped my brother and his wife would survive the concentration camps where they were dragged by the German beasts 3 years ago, but there's no trace of them. I also had another brother with a wife and children in Poland, but so far I've heard nothing from them either. You can imagine how I feel and what is going on in my heart. Now I want to rescue at least this one child for our people. It makes me, I want to cry, reading this. And I ask your advice about it. I often send packages for the child. I deny myself and do all I can, but it's not enough. My heart aches that my brother's child was converted and is being raised by Christians. I want to bring the child to America. I'm prepared to sign papers that I will keep it as my own, but my family tried to talk me out of it. The fact is that the family in France that is raising the child doesn't want to give it up because they love him very much. They tell me it will be hard to do anything, that it will be hard to do anything. So they said, this is such a hard question, but the newspaper answered, you got to get the kid back. But, you can argue both ways. It's, traumatizing for the child. And maybe, if you stay in touch with the kid, through they're 18, you can start telling him about Judaism or, acquainting him with his past. But I did not agree with necessarily with the answer. 1944, we're getting to less weighty things. I'll make it short as possible. We have 2 sons, 9 and 7. They're healthy, well-built, doing well in school and Hebrew school. So you would think everything's fine, but I have trouble with the older boy. About 9 months ago, he took it into his head to become a vegetarian and stopped eating meat. Okay, the answer. The mother is advised to find out where her son got the idea to become a vegetarian, and then with the help of a specialist, she might be able to bring him back to eating meat and fish. She is calmed and assured that a good doctor would know how to treat her 9-year-old vegetarian, and in time her son would begin to eat meat again. A few months later, the Forward printed a reply to the answer from the secretary of the Jewish Vegetarian Society, clearing things up. This is the 50s. This woman is worried that their daughter, their 23-year-old daughter, is going to remain, God forbid, a spinster. The thing is, and she said, it's all my fault. When she was quite young, in her teens, I warned her not to let boys kiss her. Now the question is, should we also talk to her and explain that a kiss from a man is not a terrible thing? We are afraid she will think we're giving her permission to be more free than she should. Okay. This is a good one. This is one of those mother-in-law things. My dear husband, we're married for 30 years. Everything's great. We have great kids. And my son and his wife invite us every Sunday over, for dinner. The only entertainment, though, there's television. Television comes up a lot, obsession with TV. We sit down in a dark room, we look at TV before and after dinner, but as often occurs with young American women, our daughter-in-law is not a great cook. It seems that the dinner is almost always from cans, and we're not used to that kind of food. Especially my husband does not like canned food, so he's not happy when Sunday comes, we have to go, and we always start a fight. My husband says it's up to me to tell the daughter-in-law that it's not a proper way to treat her husband's parents. But she didn't want to say to the daughter-in-law, she didn't want to be the wicked stepmother, which is nice. But my husband thinks it's my duty to talk to her, especially for his sake, since he can't stand the meals she prepares for us. There's a lot of letters, kids embarrassed by the parents speaking Yiddish in front of their grandchildren, and so they told them, please only come over every 2 weeks. Don't come over as frequently as you do. And then the son called up, and they thought he'd say, my wife was wrong, but the son agreed with her. So that was really hard. And then there's one from the 70s, this 85-year-old guy. There's so many marital problems, letters and marital problems in the 60s, ages 60s, 70s, and 80s. All of a sudden, it's like, everybody. All of a sudden, what am I going to do now? They don't know how the university club to go to. And So he says, my wife, she's angry at me all the time. She thinks she's doing a favor by feeding me, blah, blah, blah. He says, so this is what I want to do. My kids don't agree with me. I'm 85 years old. I want to go into an old age home and leave my wife at home. And, this happened in real life. About 10 years ago, a friend of mine here, a Jewish friend of mine, her parents were in their 90s, married for like 65 years or something like that, and they go to marriage counseling. And, they went once, and the mother says, I just don't think he's going to change. So they moved to separate senior facilities, but they talk on the phone. They talked on the phone every single day until they died. And there's another one about husband complaining about his wife's obsession with bingo. I'm almost done. And another one, when a European woman, someone from the old country, becomes Americanized. In the beginning, his, European woman was very modest and saw to it that we saved $1. This was the downside of America. The trouble is that she's become Americanized, and no matter how much money I give to her, it's not enough. She's begun to go to the beauty parlor often, and she always finds something to buy when she goes shopping in the department stores with her friends. They want to have a maid and, get their nails done, and it's just not right. This wasn't the America that we came to. All right, let me fast forward like 70, 80, 90 years. This is from 2023. A wife wrote in, when she married, she converted to Judaism for her husband. He tells her that when they got divorced, you're no longer Jewish, your Judaism went with me. So there were tons and tons of letters. It says the column was among the most read Bintel in years and generated a flood of supported comments on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Reddit, and via email. I mean, that's how popular people, still read this forward. And they quoted the Big Lebowski, the guy's devoted Jewish convert after divorcing his wife. 3,000 years of beautiful tradition from Moses to Sandy Koufax. I'm keeping it. And others do these parodies from the West Side Jet song. Once you're a Jew all the way, from your first challah slice to your last dying day. Once you're a Jew, when the schmaltz hits the pan, you've got latkes around. You're a Hanukkah man. And the last one I just want to tell you, this was from 2021, and this could have been, in 1925, 1935, and that's what I mean, the more things change, the more they remain the same. Human stories are human stories. So this one was, my sons never call. Should I give up on the relationship? I think that the Bible says it best. As it is written in Ecclesiastes, what has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. Thank you. Are there any questions? Yeah? Oh, thank you for remembering that. Oh, my God. Thank you for remembering that. Let me tell you what happened to the two men. It's so terrible. I mean, it was so upsetting to me. Okay. Oh, by the way, the youngest woman in the Triangle fire died at age 107 in 2001. Yeah. And, let me tell you what happened. All right. The owners of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory were two Jewish immigrants by the names of Blank and Harris, who survived the fire by fleeing to the roof. They were indicted for manslaughter, but acquitted largely on the basis that the prosecution could not prove that they had knowledge of the locked doors. In a subsequent civil suit, they were found liable, and each plaintiff was awarded $75 per deceased victim, which in today's world would come to $2,125 a person. However, the insurance company owners made out like bandits, having recovered about $60,000. The owners from the insurance company recovered about $60,000 more than the reported losses, as if they had been paid for about $400 a victim. Even worse, in 1913, Blank was again arrested for locking the factory doors during working hours, for which he was given a minimum fine of $20. So this is why unions,
Lori, that was fabulous.